Hello, everyone. I'm Kim Quillen with the Chicago Tribune, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to Cebu's Business of Travel webinar. We have a great panel on tap today. Our moderator is Kelly Yamanouchi from the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, and our panelists are David Koenig from the Associated Press and Hannah Sampson from the Washington Post. Welcome to our panel, and to our listeners, if you have any questions during the session, please post them in the Zoom chat. With that, I think we can get started, and I will turn things over to Kelly. Kelly?
Great. Thanks so much. I am really excited about this discussion, especially since we're looking ahead to the busy summer travel season. And there's a lot of interesting dynamics going on that could produce news, and we're going to help you prepare for that. We're going to have a really great conversation about covering the business of travel with two expert reporters who have tons of tips and resources that you can use. So our panelists are AP Airlines reporter David Koenig and Washington Post travel news reporter Hannah Sampson. And I'll tell you a little bit more about them before their opening remarks. So David covers American Airlines, Southwest Airlines, and travel features, and he's been with AP for about 25 years. Hannah reports on travel news for the Washington Post travel destination called By the Way, and she previously covered travel and tourism at Skift and the Miami Herald. So we're going to first have some opening remarks from each of the panelists. David, why don't you start us off?
Okay, thank you. Hi, Kelly, and hi to everybody who's listening in. It's a fascinating industry to cover, and I assume that's why you're watching this. It's an important industry. It's a big one. By FAA's measure, it accounts for something like 5% of the nation's GDP. It employs about 500,000 people, and we're now over 2.3 million passengers a day getting on airlines in the United States. So it's big, and it is also very interesting. People love to read about it and watch news stories about it. We go to the grocery store a couple of times a week. We go to Home Depot. We go to, the dry cleaner and all these places. And nobody talks about those businesses at parties or, but they love to talk about airlines, and they love to hate airlines is really what they do. And you see that reflected, Jimmy Fallon and Jimmy Kimmel, they don't talk about other businesses, the clothing stores, the grocery store, but they must be once a week they do a bit about an airline, and there's a reason. It's because people are curious, they want to know. So thanks for joining us, and hope we can help you learn a little bit about how you might cover the airlines and the rest of the travel business.
Hannah, why don't you go ahead?
Sure. I'm Hannah. Thanks everybody for joining. I started covering travel in 2010 for the business desk at the Miami Herald. And that was kind of a broad panoply of businesses, which included cruise, airlines, hotels, attractions, tourism. And I've never gravitated away from that beat, because it turns out it's incredibly interesting and you can tell a lot of different stories through that lens. So at the moment, I'm at the Washington Post, and we're actually now the travel section of the Washington Post, but I am not the person who travels places and then writes about those places. I'm mostly covering mayhem or business strategy with a important focus on how it affects the traveler. So I'm really able to take my business reporting background that I honed for 8 years, I guess, and apply it now to actual travelers and consumers, which is kind of the best of all worlds, I think. Like David said, it's super fun. People love to hate airlines. They love to hate actually just about every part of travel. You write about cruises, you're going to get a million comments about petri dishes. You write about Disney World, society is ending. You write about going to national parks, and they say, don't go to national parks, they're overrun. So you can pretty much find a controversy in any travel topic, but you can also find a lot of great stories and hopefully we'll be able to provide a few of the ways that we've learned to tell those stories and the kinds of data and resources that are available for telling good travel stories from a business perspective, but also in a way that will resonate with everyday readers. So thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
Wonderful. So you all can see that David and Hannah both have so much expertise and a lot of passion for their reporting. And so I think this will be a great discussion. So I have some questions for you all. First off, we know the upcoming busy summer travel season is sure to generate news, whether it's for flight disruptions or staffing issues or heavy traffic and crowds, or calls for improvements in airline service. And so for anyone who might find themselves reporting or editing a story on the travel industry, what are the most important things to know and to be aware of? And what are some good resources and places to find data on the travel business? Hannah, do you want to start us off?
Sure. It's really, there's really a question of where to even start for a story like this. You'll get TSA making projections about how many people are coming through airports. And ever since the pandemic started, they have compared the daily tallies of people passing through TSA checkpoints, which is something we should actually drop in the chat at some point. But it's really interesting to kind of compare year over year, or pretty much essentially back to pre-pandemic a lot of the time now. But that's one resource. You know, airlines will talk about their own projections for holidays or for summer. You've got different organizations like AAA that will also do forecasts. I'm getting inundated right now with Memorial Day weekend forecasts. And so that's kind of a place to start. If somebody says, I need you to do a Memorial Day weekend story, these are all places that are going to start throwing numbers at you. But you can also look at what airlines are saying. I find listening to or reading the transcripts from their most recent earning calls to be really useful. They'll talk about what they're seeing for upcoming periods of time. They'll talk about highs and lows. Those are really good places to hear directly from CEOs or top executives that you might not have access to otherwise. And I will let David pitch in to see if there are any other ideas that he has.
Yeah, no, you hit some really important ones, Hannah. And as in addition to, the TSA does the following morning, they will say how many people they screened the day before. And I and a few of my colleagues have built up, ridiculous spreadsheets so we can kind of analyze these numbers almost instantaneously and trends. And that's how I know that we're seeing more than 2.3 million people a day on the 7-day moving average. Another one that probably I assume some of you are familiar with is FlightAware, and there are other sites like it. Transstats is another that track airline cancellations and delays. So you're going to want to look at that over Memorial Day. It's broken down by airport as well. So if you're a regional, or you work at say a metro newspaper, or you focus on a particular part of the country, you can look at how your airports are doing, if there are a lot of cancellations or delays there. It's also broken down by airlines. So if you cover one particular airline, you can focus on what's happening with that particular one. So that's a good resource to check, and you'll see that mentioned in a lot of stories. Tweets are good to watch. Follow, if you report on a company in the travel industry, I probably don't need to tell you this, but follow them on Twitter and see what they're tweeting. The airlines tweet to their customers. You can tell if something is amiss because all of a sudden you'll see a bunch of messages in a row saying, we're sorry you're having such a terrible experience on our airline, and please DM us your information. Don't let everybody else see what's going on, but that'll tell you that something is amiss. So those are also, as we go into Memorial Day in the summer, you're going to want to watch those sites.
Great. So that is a great segue into my next question, which is, I was wondering if you each can tell us about why it is that the airlines and the aviation industry and travelers are still being hit with these rashes of flight disruptions, outages, and cancellations. What are the dynamics behind that? David, tell us what your insights are on that.
Yeah, well, last summer was just terrible. It wasn't your imagination. The rate of cancellations went up by 66% from May into June of last summer. When people started getting back on planes, everything went south. It was just, service was terrible. And there was a reason for that. The airlines had gotten rid of a lot of employees during the pandemic. You'll probably remember that they got $54 billion in a federal bailout, and that prohibited them from laying people off or furloughing them, as it's called in the business, because they have rehiring rights. But that didn't stop the airlines from paying people to leave, to take early retirement or quit for some other reason. And Congress left them that loophole, and the airlines ran right through it, and they got rid of tens of thousands of employees. And that showed up. They were not ready when travel bounced back last year. Now, this year, they say they are ready. They certainly talked about it during their first quarter earnings calls. Hannah mentioned the importance of listening to those. And the numbers back them up. If you look at the government, the Bureau of Transportation Statistics reports on employment in the airline industry, that's a helpful source. They're reporting that employment now is above where it was in 2019 for the same months. So they seem to have enough people on board, and they're talking optimistically about being able to handle it, and we'll see. In addition to that, the FAA has its own shortages in key areas. You may have seen last summer they had problems in Florida because they had some staffing issues at a site in Jacksonville, a really important center. This year, I think Ground Zero is going to be kind of this center on Long Island that handles a lot of the traffic going up and down the East Coast and into the New York airports. And so FAA even is encouraging the airlines and encourage them to cut their flights in and out of New York this summer. And we'll see if that helps. A lot of independent observers think it was a smart thing to do, and it will definitely help. Whether it's enough, that's one thing we're going to be watching as summer starts.
I mean, and there's also just, summer thunderstorms can throw such a wrench into everything. And travel was down 2020, 2021. And so we didn't have as many planes and as many people traveling, but maybe we've forgotten how messy it can get just in a regular summer. But I feel like with full planes, a lot of people traveling this summer, we get some bad weather. And I think we're all going to remember just how much that can totally mess up a day. I mean, I'm very concerned about traveling with my 2-year-old on a plane for the first time. And I'm just praying for all the good weather on the days that we're flying, so we don't end up in an airport for 5 to 7 hours.
Absolutely. So we are already posting some links to resources into the chat for attendees to see. So definitely check those out when you have a chance, if you could use them for future stories. And I also wanted to ask David and Hannah about when it comes to labor shortages and staffing issues, how do you track that data? Hannah, do you want to start on that?
I'm gonna kick part of this question to David, because tracking, some of my colleagues have written more of those stories than I have on tracking federal labor information. But I hate to keep ringing the bell of listening to earnings calls, but companies will talk about this a lot, and analysts will ask them about this in earnings calls. And you can always also shoot a message to their PR people to ask, but that's not always the best answer you're going to get. So if you're able to kind of access those occasions when executives are being questioned by analysts about these things that are important to their business performance, it's also really helpful as a journalist. And maybe David can weigh in on the kind of federal sources for that too.
Yeah. Yeah, that's done by the Bureau of Transportation Statistics, which is part of the Transportation Department. And I'll try and post the website here in the chat. But they have lots of great information. It's broken down by airline and by month, so you can analyze it pretty closely. The drawback, as those of you who've dealt with government statistics might anticipate, is that it's not up to date. It's not real current. I looked maybe a week ago, and the most recent numbers at that point were from December. So it does run behind. So your best source of current information is going to be the company and their spokespeople. The companies will publish every year in their 10Ks how many employees they have, and they will break that down, at least among those who have union representation. They will break that down by work group, which is really helpful. But if you want to, we're already now into May, so those numbers from December 31st are probably not current. So you're going to just have to get on the phone or send an email and try and get the spokespeople to give you an updated number. That's the best way to do it. And they have been talking at length on these earning calls about how many people that they've been hiring, and some of them have been giving numbers, United and Delta in particular, giving a lot of numbers around how many people they've hired and how many pilots they've hired and how many more people they're going to hire and all of that.
Absolutely.
I just want to jump in on the, David mentioned 10K, and I can't even tell you what a dork I am about the SEC and SEC filings for like the last 10 years, when I realized I could ask PR people questions that they would ignore, and then I could just go to their SEC filings and find out all the answers. So I've spent a lot of time just reading through proxy statements and 10Ks and 8Ks. And we're going to drop the Edgar search. I don't know why it's called Edgar, but the search function to find those company filings on the SEC. We'll drop that in the chat. Probably everybody's aware of it. Somebody had to introduce me to it when I started as a business reporter. And it's just a great resource. And then if every now and then you might get like a notice about an 8K, like an unscheduled event dropping at 5 p.m. and it might be news about like the company's being investigated by the SEC for misleading investors or something. And that's always a great resource for breaking stories.
Absolutely. Very good point. So I did want to just remind people who are watching the webinar that if you have any questions for our panelists, please drop them into the chat and we can get to them after this Q&A session, and we'd love to take your questions. So the next thing that I wanted to ask both of you is about, we've seen a number of airline strike votes and labor issues cropping up this year. And I'm wondering what people need to know about how unions work in the airline industry in particular. David, do you want to start on that?
Sure. Yeah. First of all, the airline industry is one of the most heavily unionized industries in the private sector. At the three of the big four, American, United, and Southwest, they're roughly 80% of their employees are represented by a union. Delta less so. Delta's pilots are union, but most of their other employees are not. It's important to understand that there's a particular federal law called the Railway Labor Act that only applies to airlines and railways. It dates back to the 30s, I think. And in a nutshell, it just makes it really, really hard for airline workers to go out on strike legally. They have to get permission almost. They have the National Mediation Board, these federal mediators have to declare that they're at an impasse. There's no point in further negotiations between the union and the airline. And that it starts another process where there's a cooling off period. And even if you get to the end of the cooling off period and the union thinks it can strike, or the airline thinks it can lock out its workers, Congress or the president can jump in. And that has happened. That happened in the 90s when Bill Clinton came in and shut down a strike at American Airlines minutes after midnight, after it was going to start. And we saw that in December with the railroad workers when President Biden signed a bill that had been passed by Congress to prevent the railway workers from going out on strike. So it's really hard for airline employees to go on strike legally, and your story should reflect that. There are experts out there on the Railway Labor Act if you really want to get deep into the weeds and explain to your readers why this is so, but you at least need to reassure your your readers that these employees are highly unlikely to go out on strike anytime soon. Now, if we get to the situation where the mediators do give this release to a union anywhere to strike, that's noteworthy, that's newsworthy in itself. And that did happen. The last strike we had was at Spirit Airlines more than 10 years ago. But so it can happen, but it's unusual.
David covered that so well, and I have nothing to add to the content of that. But I would just say, in terms of coverage of the issue, David at the AP will be like providing fantastic, straightforward coverage. And when my editors asked what we could do on a strike story, I was just like, I don't know. There's already really good information out there. So our approach was just to do kind of an FAQ and find some experts. We found someone who knows a lot about the National Labor Railway Act, who was able to dig into some of the weeds a little bit, and then talk to the airlines and the unions about kind of what they're saying, and just do it in a very digestible way that asks and answers the questions regular travelers are most likely to be asking, just to get that information out there. Like, no, if you have a flight next week, it's not going to be canceled because everyone's striking, and to add some of that context. So just in terms of presenting that information to readers, that's something that we found is very doable for us, and also is something we can turn around pretty quickly, because of course that's also the demand, is to, figure out this nuanced subject, dig into the details of 1920s acts, and then say why it matters to people.
This is going to be timely too, because there's a good chance that in the next couple of days, you're going to see headlines about workers at WestJet, a Canadian low-cost airline, going out on strike. They voted a few days ago to give 72 hours to the company that they could strike. I'm not an expert on Canadian labor law. I don't know what hoops they have to go through, but the airline has started canceling a few flights for tomorrow and Saturday. So it looks like they're very worried that there could be a strike there. But even still, that's, different laws. The laws in the US just make it really hard to strike. There are airline workers have conducted job actions, but for instance, in around, I think it was 1999, the American Airlines pilots conducted a sick out, and their union, a federal judge ordered their union to pay $45 million to the company. Now the company and the union negotiated that down, they whittled it down, but union leaders are going to remember that. They're going to see that even more recently. I think it was 2019, a federal judge sided with American in a dispute they were having with some of their other employees. And, the judges have sided with the companies when the companies have complained that there are illegal job actions going on. So it's even wildcat strikes are risky for the airline workers.
Right, that's a good point on WestJet in Canada. I think people may see, those kinds of job actions in other countries, and in Europe, for example, there have been quite a few labor actions affecting airlines and rail and transportation generally. But it is there is a different set of laws in the U.S. for airlines in particular, and so that means there's a lot different dynamics in terms of the remoteness, I guess, of a airline strike versus what you see in other countries. And so, the next thing that I wanted to ask about is about how to bring, some voices of travelers and real people into stories. There's some very human elements of travel industry stories, particularly when you see disruptions and flight cancellations, etc. So I'd love to hear your tips and tricks for getting voices of real people into stories. And Hannah, would love to get your ideas.
Yeah, absolutely. I spend a lot of my time looking for actual people to interview about their travel experiences. And David had a great point earlier when he said, watch Twitter. Twitter is, obviously changing in the last couple of months, but I'm still finding it useful. That's one of the first places I go, especially when, when Southwest was melting down over the holidays. I found a ton of people on there who were tweeting at Southwest, or who were just kind of tweeting like, Southwest, thanks so much, you've ruined my Christmas. Great place to start. I usually try to go beyond that, especially if I'm doing a story that's not necessarily breaking news. If I'm doing kind of a longer feature, I'll go to Facebook travel groups, Disney groups, or cruise groups, or Airbnb groups, Instagram. A lot of people will put their complaints on Instagram. TikTok is a whole new world where people are creating content left and right that I've had to kind of catch up on, but another great resource. There's not always a way to reach folks. You can't always slip into the DMs, but you can always leave a comment. A lot of the time people might have another contact option for them on any of those social media accounts. And I also will often reach out to travel agents who not only kind of have good insight into what their travelers are saying and how they're kind of trying to help travelers who are in the middle of a mess, but they're travelers a lot too. So I might call a travel agent about what they're seeing from their clients, but also their own travels and how they've been affected by whatever disruptions, strikes, prices, crowds. And that's always pretty useful too. So I used to think about when I covered travel for the Miami Herald, this was a long time ago, and I had to go to the airport to find people. And now that I'm not just covering travel for one region, I don't want to just interview everybody I run into at DCA. There has to be a way to reach the wider world, and social media and all of those different outlets have really kind of helped connect me with people on a daily basis almost.
Great. Excellent advice. David, do you have any other thoughts on that?
I think Hannah covered that really, really well and hit the two I would mention, which are Twitter and the travel agencies. The travel agents, particularly if you have maybe not so much somebody who's affected by an immediate event that's happened or some problem going on at one of the airlines, but maybe if you're working on some other kind of travel related story, you're looking for people who are going to a certain place or something else, and you've got some time, travel agents can be a really good source there. Twitter, for us, the challenge is we won't just post a tweet because we don't know who that person is. We don't know if that person is who they say they are. So we have to verify it. And Hannah mentioned, it's nice if they, on their social media, they give like very few people will put their email address, but maybe there's a website or something, and you can track them down that way and verify them. And of course, you can just tweet right at them and say, please tweet back. Of course, now you've tipped off your competitors, your other reporters. Oh, look, the AP is talking to this person. Why are they doing that? And they'll go and look. They might go and look and see why we might be interested in talking to that person. So that's kind of a risk. But a lot of times, and particularly with stories like things like summer travel, we do want people also on video or a photo of them. So I do it kind of the OG way that Hannah mentioned, which is just go to the airport and talk to them and get a nice, that way our videographer can get a nice shot of them in the background. You can see it's at an airport. And so, it puts it all in context. But so that I know it's very few reporters enjoy going out to the airport and grabbing strangers and trying to get them to talk. But sometimes that's the best way to go about it.
It takes up a lot of a day, which sometimes is great. Sometimes you want that.
Right. You know, one good thing about interviewing travelers, I spend a lot of time, at the airport, since I focus on the Atlanta airport, and talking to people there. One good thing about it is people are interested in talking about their trips often because it's something new and something novel for them. It's not just like, like David said, like talking about going to the grocery store or what have you. They're often, excited about their trip. And when it gets disrupted, they have real emotions, to share. And so that's one nice thing about getting to talk to travelers in person, is that it's a little bit easier to get some of them to talk than it is about other topics that you might be randomly approaching people on the street about. So the other thing, I guess a somewhat related question is how people should approach the spread of viral stories in the travel area, and the wide range of types of travel related viral stories that we see on social media. So we see passenger incidents caught on video a lot. We see celebrity posts about their trips and, experience on airlines. And then, of course, we see, like you mentioned, a whole bunch of passenger complaints when things go wrong. Do you think that there is a strategy for covering these and how to do them well and responsibly? Hannah, do you have some thoughts on that?
Yes, we pay attention to these all the time, all day, every day, just to kind of see what's bubbling up and what people are talking about. Sometimes it is very silly, and maybe it's like somebody's barefoot touching a touch screen on the plane and everybody's grossed out. I had to argue for a long time that we could actually write a story about bare feet on planes and publish it in the Washington Post. I think it took months before we actually did anything along those lines. But for the most part, we're looking for if there's news, if it's a disruptive passenger kind of incident, if we can confirm it with the police and get the airline to say something. We often will write it with the context of unruly disruptive passenger events having spiked in 2021, and how the FAA and Justice Department have tried to crack down on that since. So that's always important context that we add if we do any of those stories. Often someone will be charged federally, and then there will be some kind of a charging document that you can find in Pacer, which is my other favorite dorky thing to spend time on. Like in federal court filings, there's usually a pretty good narrative of what's alleged to have happened. And then when it's a silly thing, for example, recently a baseball player tweeted about his pregnant wife having been forced to clean up the popcorn that their toddler spilled on a flight. We said, like, what are we gonna do with this? Okay, we're gonna write it. And we wrote about it in the context of, this is kind of the latest great debate about airline courtesy or airline habits, airline annoyances. Whose job is it to pick up after your kids? And so we talked about the incident. We broadened it a little bit to talk to an etiquette expert who was also a one-time flight attendant, and then put that in the context of, people losing their minds over somebody eating a rack of messy ribs while they're flying, or any other annoying airline pet peeve that people have. So we're not too good for that, but we also always want to add some kind of context and say, put in the bigger picture of things that matter to travelers and things that annoy travelers.
That the popcorn story, I thought was, an interesting one, because it is about, the dynamics on airplanes, but it's also, broader than that, right? It's about, I guess, parenting and, people who observe parenting and
people who want kids kicked off planes all the time.
Right.
Right.
Yeah. I mean, there's so many dynamics in that. And then you have the celebrity element also. So yeah, but I definitely agree that, it's good to, have the context and the news as part of that. David, what are your thoughts on this?
People behave badly all over, in all sorts of settings, but somehow it's newsier when they do it on an airplane. I think we have generally, gradually over time, come to ignore most of them. If there's an arrest or if there's violence involved, obviously not. That raises it to a different level. I think the first one in the pandemic that really caught our attention and we wrote about extensively was the woman who punched a flight attendant and knocked out a couple of her teeth on a Southwest flight that after it landed in San Diego. But we do try and set a pretty high bar, because if I had to write about every one of these things that goes viral, I would do nothing but write about viral incidents, and some of them are pretty stupid. But if there is any question of somebody, I should point out one thing, and it does get pointed out sometimes in stories and sometimes not, and we forget about it, but you'll see lots of reports of people trying to open doors while the plane is in flight. There is no way to do that. It's just a matter of physics. The doors, it's kind of the way they are sealed, you would need superhuman strength to open that thing while the plane is pressurized. Once the plane's on the ground, then it's a lot easier. But and this the discussion of these unruly passenger incidents kind of leads me to another topic, but emergency landings. There are lots of little stories that I see, and I get Google alerts when a plane is diverted somewhere and it makes what's termed an emergency landing. And even in cases where the pilots have actually declared an emergency so that they can land quickly is basically the reason there. A lot of them are pretty ordinary, even things that sound terrible, like the tires blowing out on an airplane, are usually not all that, they're not a dangerous situation. The exception that I've kind of told our people, since AP operates very decentrally, and so sometimes people, a reporter somewhere in the country or in another country will write about one of these emergency landings. If there's fire involved, even if it's limited to the engine, yeah, that probably raises it to the level of, hey, we'd like to do a story on that. But if it's just being, if they've turned around because some cockpit indicator went off, you can probably ignore it. You might still want to call NTSB and the FAA and ask them, is there anything to this? Are you investigating? You might ask the airline about it, but a lot of those cases we decide in the end not to write about them.
There's also often an opportunity, if there's like a viral video of some severe turbulence or something like that, an opportunity to spin that into some kind of an explainer on, how dangerous is turbulence? How often are you seeing turbulence? What kind of stats are out there? What do experts say about the impact of climate change on turbulence? I did a recent bird strike explainer because there had been some, I don't even remember the story that kicked it off, but even if we're not writing about the original news, maybe GA is, or maybe nobody is, we'll look for opportunities to do something kind of quick and explanatory that has some service to readers to kind of maybe answer the questions that are out there because of the headlines floating around.
Excellent strategy. Excellent. One thing that I have always found interesting is that a majority of people do not travel very often, yet there's still tremendous interest in these stories on the travel industry and on airlines. And I just wanted to ask you both, why do you think that is? Why is there so much interest in travel, even by people who don't travel very much? And do you think that there are ways to make that we should make travel coverage more relevant to people, even if they aren't traveling anytime soon? David, your thoughts?
I think it's because people just have so much emotionally invested in trips that they do take. And I think it was the CEO of American Airlines said a couple of years ago that something like 80% of their passengers only take one trip a year. So you can just imagine folks who are taking one trip a year. It's to go home for the holidays. It's to go to a wedding or a funeral or see their family or a vacation they've been saving up for a long time. And when things go wrong and their flight gets canceled, and they look outside the plane and it looks like the weather's fine, and why is my flight being canceled? Yeah, they are really, really upset in a way that, if I get home and the Chick-fil-A messed up my order, okay, I'm annoyed that they did, but it's not like I obsess about that, but it's a different thing when we travel, because that trip is so important to us.
Yeah, I agree. It's such an aspirational thing, and I mean, lately such an expensive thing that somebody might have been saving all year or for multiple years. I think it was in 2020, I did a story about kind of like the landmark trips that people were missing that year because of the pandemic, like the 50th anniversaries that they've been planning forever, the family reunions. And it just kind of drove home how much, even if somebody has waited 5 years especially if somebody has waited 5 years for a trip, how much emotion there is just in this one trip that they're taking. But in addition to that, I think one of the things that we try to do is not just focus on like international flights or domestic flights or once in a lifetime trips, but also the kind of closer to home travel that people might be doing. So when we're writing stories about holiday travel or stories about prices, we're also going to talk about gas prices and hotels and Airbnb and all of the smaller kinds of travel that people might do more frequently, even if it's just shorter road trips, because that's also relevant to their lives and probably something they're engaging in a lot more often. And as David said earlier, people love to hate things about travel. So even if you particularly are not flying or staying at a hotel with ridiculous resort fees, people love to hate fees, and fees are great fodder for stories. So Airbnb cleaning fees or airline baggage fees or Spirit charging you for water or a hotel. I recently wrote a story about some of the weirdest things that hotels add to their resort fees, like coconut husking lessons or clam chowder. People love to look at that and just roll their eyes. And even if it's not a place they would ever go or a thing they would ever do, it sparks an interest, just even if it's just an eye roll.
Yeah, now that's a really important point that Hannah made, that many, many more people drive to vacations in this country than take planes. And so, yeah, you've got to cover that angle. And just like you say, Airbnb, I mean, we've written about the cleaning fees and the lists of chores that some of the hosts leave, and that stuff went viral. And people love to read about that too, because like you say, they got worked up about it. It's no accident that Biden had a press conference, about a week ago, where he announced that the Department of Transportation is going to be drafting some new regulations aimed at airlines and compensating passengers when they cause a delay or a cancellation, and he took at them again for what he calls junk fees. And the folks who work for Biden, they know junk fees resonate with voters, so they're gonna make that point.
We always used to talk about Hey Martha stories when I was at the Herald, where you might have like Matt sitting at the table with his wife Martha, and he reads something and he's like, "Hey Martha, look at that." And even if they're never staying at an Airbnb in their life, they can be like, these guys are making people clean their kitchens and then they have to pay $200. It's
Right.
It's something that resonates, I think, with the broader audience.
I definitely agree about that. The aspirational point that you made, Hannah, and it's easy to forget that for a lot of people, it's a huge chunk of money that they're spending on, a trip, especially if they're flying somewhere. For them, it's a, big part of their budget, and the fees are, sometimes unexpected. And then also that people want to talk, what I find anyway, is that people want to talk about their trips, and discussing fees and what upset them is kind of an entree into that. And then the other thing is that I think psychologically, in terms of in-flight incidents, there's this underlying, whether it's a fear of flying or anxiety about being stuck in a metal tube in the air, just kind of makes these stories resonate in, on another level for people versus, other types of incidents that may happen on the ground. And so, so there's all of these dynamics that make it an unusual beat to cover, right? So another reminder, if there are any questions from the audience, please feel free to post them in the chat. We'd love to answer any of your questions. No, so the next thing that I wanted to ask you all in the meantime is what other big stories on summer travel do you think there will be this year? What are you preparing for? And what are the best ways to cover those?
I'll go first. I think we've mentioned, with summer travel, we're going to be looking at, if there are problems recovering from bad weather, because there will be bad weather. And we saw last summer that Southwest in particular had trouble recovering from bad weather. And then in December, they just had a meltdown after a snowstorm that everybody else recovered from in a couple of days. And so that's what we're going to be looking for. The airlines are blaming FAA. FAA has been blaming the airlines, and the passengers are kind of caught in the middle. Beyond that, I think there's a lot of concern now about whether the demand bubble, this really strong travel demand that started early last year, when's it going to cool off, and is it going to cool off? And we're starting to see some signs that it might be. So that's something we're going to be watching. The whole issue of passenger rights and compensation, what the transportation department is probably going to propose is some style of compensation similar to what they have in Europe, where you don't just settle for getting your ticket refunded. That's pretty much all airlines are required to do in the United States now, even if they cause the cancellation, but some form of compensation beyond that, including paying for your hotel if you have to get one, and paying for meals and things like that. So passenger rights broadly is going to be something else we're watching closely. You mentioned the labor shortages and the pilot shortage in particular. We've written about that and tried to take a different tack on that by going out to United's academy out in the desert in Phoenix, and flying with a new student pilot who told me and my photographer, "Hey, you guys are my first passengers." So I wasn't sure how to take that, but we did. It worked out fine, and she's going to be a great pilot. So those are things worth watching. Another one, maybe not immediately, but pretty quickly, how are drones and what are called eVTOLs, which are planes that are electric powered and take off and land like a helicopter vertically. Those are coming, and we've got an airspace that's already crowded. Can barely handle the planes that are out there flying. How are we going to handle and absorb all these drones and all these eVTOLs that are going to be flying around? So that's something that's going to be need to be closely watched.
And I think we're going to keep watching prices and see kind of how the cost of travel is continuing to normalize or not. As we've seen this year, kind of domestic flights are around back to pre-pandemic prices, but international travel to certain parts of the world is significantly higher. So kind of how that shakes out, and even how it shapes demand moving forward. And then there's an issue that we spent a lot of time about before the pandemic, something that has been coined over tourism, but basically the flood of visitors to places that are overwhelmed by them. So like Venice and Dubrovnik and Amsterdam. Actually, we've seen Amsterdam start some campaigns to keep to keep stag parties, to keep bachelor parties from the UK away, an actual like stay away campaign. So how are destinations that are kind of flooded with maybe misbehaving tourists or just too many tourists, including like in Nashville, in the US, how are they dealing with that, and kind of what approaches are they taking to more sustainability? Hawaii has been struggling with this for a while, even to the point of talking about disbanding their tourism authority. I don't actually know if they did that, but that's been a conversation for a while. So that's an issue that we think about a lot, especially since we're kind of talking about directly to travelers about where they're going. And then this is very niche, but we're watching the kind of debate between Disney, the Disney company, and the state of Florida and Florida's governor as that continues to unfold and lawsuits are filed. And the CEO of Disney talks about, you know, the 17 billion that they planned to invest in Florida and whether that will or will not happen if conditions aren't favorable under the state as things stand right now. So our readers love, they love to read about Disney, they love to hate on Disney, but it's a huge tourism generator and a huge travel destination. So it's important to us.
Many intersections with politics in the travel industry, indeed. You know, so what you just mentioned, Hannah, about over-tourism actually delves nicely into a question that we got from someone in the chat. Lisa said she is a business reporter in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, which has experienced visitor numbers surpassing 2019, and is saying we don't have a big airport there in Lancaster, and she's curious about whether this level of tourism is sustainable given people are flying more now. And she's working on a story about that, and she's asking where to look for story ideas on uncovering that issue in tourism in the community. Anna, do you have any thoughts on that?
I mean, this is a great question because I think communities around the country have been dealing with this, especially during the pandemic when tourism, like travel patterns shifted a lot and people were trying to go to more remote places, which maybe is something that Lancaster benefited from. But I think it's worth kind of looking for other destinations that have suddenly, or maybe not suddenly, but who have seen numbers grow significantly and how they've handled that kind of for case studies. I've talked to places like this in the past about, I'm trying to think of some off the top of my head. There are some places that have instituted like tourism pledges to try to kind of calm some bad behavior that they've seen from guests. But also there are some organizations like, I want to say sustainable travel, responsible travel, I think a responsible travel organization that can talk about some of the ways that destinations can grow in ways that are not too overwhelming. There's sometimes some good thinkers there. I will sometimes talk to like tourism professors at universities, either in your own state or in other states who study these things. They're often pretty helpful to talk about ways that tourism growth can be sustainable or not. In terms of the airport, I mean, airlines kind of think about where demand is and they send more planes where people want to fly, but also it's a small airport. So, you know, the bigger jets that are flying more often now are probably not going that much to Lancaster. So that's a big question. And I'm not really sure like what the solution to that is. If more people are flying there, is it that they're flying to nearby bigger airports and then finding ways to get to that destination specifically? Some airlines have added like bus links to get to your final destination. I'm not sure that's going to happen there, but those are all kinds of some of the big questions that I think a big picture story would be great to look at.
I wonder if there's a tourism authority in Lancaster that maybe is advertising somewhere. I suspect that that there they get most of their visitors by car or bus from DC. I mean, when we lived in Washington, we went up to the Lancaster area a couple of times, and we drove. You know, we weren't going to take a flight. There is the separate issue, maybe this is part of it, that a lot of smaller communities are losing their air service either entirely or in large part. Early on, I mentioned at the beginning of our hour the bailout, the federal bailout that the airlines got, $54 billion. That included a prohibition on ending service to these smaller communities, but that is over now, and we've seen them cutting service to a lot of smaller communities, and that's probably going to continue for the same reasons that Hannah hinted at there. The economics are just more favorable. They'd rather add another flight between Los Angeles and San Francisco than a flight to, to Fresno or something. So we're probably going to see that continue.
We also have a question from an attendee named Randy, who is asking about informal strikes. He says that he was on a number of American Airlines flights out of major hubs in 2021, and the pilots would announce that there was a so-called mechanical issue and would delay the plane for several hours or it would be canceled. And he says it happened too much to be a coincidence. David, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, that's they call that work to rule, and that is something that airline pilots in particular have been known to do in the past, where they and I wrote about this, by the way, last week in a story that the headline was about the strike votes at American and Southwest, but I interviewed some people and quoted one of the experts on the history of this work to rule thing. So pilots, if they can't legally strike, what they can do is say, well, I'm just not going to fly any overtime. And airlines depend heavily on pilots and flight attendants to work overtime during peak times like summer and the December holidays. So they can do that, or they can do this work to rule where the checklist of items that they get from their mechanics has to be just perfect. And if they can see some reason, any reason, to send the plane back to the hangar to have something looked at, they'll do it. And the airlines have, complained about that and alleged that there have been illegal job actions like that in the past. It's hard for them to prove, though. And if that is a threat, some people believe that's a real threat this summer, that if negotiations between the airlines that have not settled with their major unions, and that's primarily American, United, and Southwest, if they're still negotiating this summer and their workers really get ticked off, maybe we will see some of that. It's hard to predict because the unions obviously don't want to publicize that, or they'd be accused of organizing a strike or a job action that's illegal. But it's a possibility. Whether it happened in 2021, I don't know.
Okay, excellent. Good advice. Thank you so much. So we're coming up on the end of our hour here, and I just wanted to thank everyone for joining us today, and thank you to David and Hannah for all of your great tips that I think will really help people a lot with their coverage this summer and well beyond that. And I wanted to also mention that this session has been recorded, and Cebu will be tweeting out a link to it on Monday. So if you know of anyone who could benefit from these insights, please feel free to share that link with them when it comes out on Monday. And you can also check cebu.org for future training webinars. David and Hannah, any closing comments before we close out? David?
Not really. I'd be happy to help anybody with questions after this is over. But no, just thanks for listening.
Hannah?
Yeah, I mean, same here. Anybody ever want to bounce a story idea off that's relevant to your local community? I'm happy to help just based on my own experiences, and appreciate you tuning in and your interest.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. And take care, everyone, and have a great rest of your day.